How the Beatles actually died. The final days at Apple Corps, London, 1969. The grand facade of Apple Corps on Savile Row, once a vibrant symbol of artistic freedom and utopian ideals, now felt like a mausoleum. The psychedelic murals and whimsical boutiques had faded, replaced by an air of palpable tension and simmering resentment. The Beatles, the band that had once conquered the world with their unity and innovation, were dying. Not with a bang, but with the slow, agonizing rot of mistrust and legal wrangling. John Lennon, his face often etched with a weary defiance, walked through the once bustling corridors, now eerily quiet. The laughter was gone. The creative spark had been replaced by the cold, hard reality of business. The dream of Apple, conceived as a benevolent, artist-run conglomerate, had curdled. It was hemorrhaging money, plagued by mismanagement, and becoming a battleground for competing egos and conflicting visions. Paul McCartney, ever the pragmatist, fought desperately to save it, to keep the band together, to maintain some semblance of the magic. George Harrison, increasingly disillusioned, sought solace in his spiritual journey and his burgeoning solo songwriting. Ringo Starr, the quiet anchor, watched helplessly as his friends, his brothers, tore each other apart. The city outside, still reeling from the cultural explosion the Beatles had ignited, was oblivious to the silent war being waged within Apple's walls. They saw the headlines, the rumors, the increasingly acrimonious public statements, but they couldn't see the true depth of the fracture. The core of the problem was control and money, and the insidious creep of outside forces eager to capitalize on the band's immense yet increasingly vulnerable empire. John, desperate for a solution, for someone to cut through the corporate jargon and reclaim their fortunes, had brought in Alan Klein, a shrewd, controversial American manager known for his aggressive tactics. Paul, however, vehemently opposed Klein, advocating for his father-in-law, Lee Eastman. This fundamental disagreement, this clash of loyalties and visions, became the final, fatal blow. The Beatles were not just a band, they were a phenomenon, a cultural force that had transcended music. But even phenomena, even empires, can fall. And in 1969, in the heart of London, the Beatles were taking their last, agonizing breaths. Their death wasn't a sudden event, but a slow, public execution, and witnessed by the world, but understood by few. This is how the Beatles actually died. The initial vision for Apple Corps was revolutionary. Born from the Beatles' immense wealth and their desire to create a creative haven, it was meant to be a utopian experiment, a place where artists could flourish, where innovation was encouraged, and where the usual corporate shackles were cast aside. They launched Apple Records, Apple Films, Apple Electronics, even an Apple boutique. The early days were filled with a chaotic, youthful exuberance. They signed new artists, funded experimental projects, and indulged in lavish spending. But the dream quickly curdled. The Beatles, brilliant musicians, were terrible businessmen. They lacked structure, oversight, and a clear financial strategy. Money flowed out faster than it came in. Friends and hangers-on took advantage. The benevolent aspect of Apple quickly devolved into financial chaos. John, always the most cynical and anti-establishment, grew increasingly frustrated. He saw the waste, the mismanagement, and the endless bickering over trivial matters. He felt the weight of their immense fortune being squandered. Paul, on the other hand, tried to impose order. He was the one who saw the impending financial disaster, the one who tried to rein in the excesses. But his attempts were often met with resentment, perceived as controlling. especially by John. George, weary of being overshadowed as a songwriter, felt his own creative voice stifled within the group. He poured his energy into his solo work, finding solace in spiritual pursuits, increasingly detached from the daily dramas of Apple. Ringo, ye ever the quiet anchor, found himself caught in the middle, a reluctant witness to the escalating tensions. He loved his bandmates, but the joy of making music had been replaced by the bitterness of boardroom battles. The atmosphere at Apple Corps became toxic. The creative energy that had once defined them was replaced by suspicion and animosity. Meetings devolved into shouting matches. The press, sensing blood in the water, feasted on the rumors of their impending split. The utopian dream had become a nightmare. The very structure they had created to free themselves from the music industry's constraints had become a gilded cage, trapping them in a web of their own making. The Beatles were still making music, still releasing albums like Abbey Road, which ironically showcased their enduring genius. But the unity, or the unspoken bond that had fueled their creativity, was gone. The rot had set in, and the core of Apple, once so vibrant, was slowly, irrevocably decaying. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. The arrival of Alan Klein in 1969 was the final, decisive blow. John, desperate for someone to take charge of Apple's spiraling finances, saw Klein as a ruthless savior. Klein promised to recover their money, to cut through the bureaucracy, and to put Apple back on track. John, along with George and Ringo, signed a management agreement with Klein. Paul, however, vehemently opposed Klein. He saw him as a shark, a manipulator who would ultimately exploit them. Paul wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, a respected entertainment lawyer, to manage their affairs. This fundamental disagreement plunged the Beatles into an unprecedented legal and personal war. It wasn't just about business, it was about trust, loyalty, and the very soul of the band. The Apple offices became a battleground. Klein, with John's backing, began to assert control, making drastic cuts, firing staff, and attempting to renegotiate contracts. Paul, feeling increasingly isolated and betrayed, fought back, refusing to acknowledge Klein's authority. The arguments were brutal. John, fueled by his own frustrations and a deep-seated rebellion against Paul's perceived dominance, lashed out. He saw Paul's resistance as an attempt to control him, to keep him tied to the past. George and Ringo, caught in the middle, found themselves in an impossible position. They had sided with John, but they also felt the pain of the fractured friendships. The legal documents for the dissolution of the Beatles' partnership, the final, painful severing of ties, required all four signatures. John had signed Klein's agreement, believing it was the only way forward, but Paul refused to sign the dissolution papers, hoping to keep the band together, even as it was clearly falling apart. The battle for control wasn't just over money or management. It was over their identity, over their legacy, over who would ultimately write the final chapter of the Beatles' story. The once unbreakable bond of the Fab Four was now a tangled mess of legal injunctions, bitter accusations, and profound heartbreak. The dream of Apple, the dream of the Beatles, was being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. And in the heart of London, the world watched, horrified, as the greatest band in history tore itself apart. The internal strife at Apple Corps could not be contained. It spilled out into the public, becoming a tabloid-feeding frenzy. Headlines screamed about lawsuits, betrayals, and the impending breakup of the Beatles. Fans, once united in their adoration, were now divided, taking sides in the bitter feud. John, always the most outspoken, used interviews to air his grievances, often making scathing remarks about Paul and the state of the band. He felt liberated by his honesty, but his words only deepened the chasm between them. Paul, more reserved, expressed his pain through his music and his increasingly desperate attempts to keep the band from dissolving. He released his first solo album, McCartney, in April 1970, a quiet, introspective record that hinted at his disillusionment. The release of Let It Be in May 1970, an album cobbled together from earlier sessions and heavily reproduced by Phil Spector, at John's insistence, much to Paul's dismay, felt less like a celebration and more like a eulogy. The accompanying film, documenting the band's final recording sessions, was a stark, uncomfortable portrayal of their unraveling. The joy was gone, replaced by tension, arguments, and a palpable sense of exhaustion. The world watched as their heroes, once symbols of unity and happiness, became figures of discord and sadness. The magic seemed to have vanished, replaced by a very human, very painful reality. The final legal blow came on December 31st, 1970, when Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit in the High Court in London to dissolve the Beatles' contractual partnership. It was a desperate act, a legal maneuver to free himself and the band's assets from Alan Klein's control. The news sent shockwaves around the globe. The Beatles officially were no more. John, George, and Ringo, though initially angered by Paul's unilateral action, he eventually understood its necessity. The legal battle would drag on for years, but the decision had been made. The band was dead. The final days at Apple Corps were not about music. They were about lawyers, accountants, and the agonizing process of disentanglement. The dream had died, not in a blaze of glory, but in the sterile confines of a courtroom. The empire, built on 3 chords and a dream, had crumbled under the weight of its own success, its own internal conflicts, and the relentless pressure of the world it had so profoundly changed. The legal battle for the dissolution of the Beatles' partnership dragged on for years, a painful, public spectacle that overshadowed their individual creative endeavors. The High Court in London, a place of solemnity and tradition, became the final stage for the band's demise. Lawyers argued over percentages, royalties, and the ownership of their vast musical catalogue. The former bandmates, once inseparable, now sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, their faces grim, their bond irrevocably broken. John, still fiercely loyal to Klein, found himself increasingly isolated. As Klein's questionable business practices came to light, even George and Ringo began to distance themselves. The financial chaos Klein had promised to fix only seemed to worsen, leading to more lawsuits and deeper mistrust. Paul, though victorious in his legal fight to remove Klein, paid a heavy emotional price. He was branded the villain by some fans, the one who had broken up the Beatles. The weight of that accusation, combined with the loss of his creative partnership, was immense. The formal dissolution of the Beatles' partnership was finally achieved in 1975. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a saga that had dominated headlines for half a decade. There was no grand farewell, no final concert, just the stroke of a judge's pen, making official what had been true for years. The aftermath was a period of profound individual transformation for each Beatle. John, disillusioned by the music industry and the legal battles, retreated from the public eye, embracing fatherhood and domesticity in New York. He sought peace, a quiet life away from the chaos of fame and the bitterness of the past. Paul embarked on a successful solo career with Wings, proving his creative independence, but the shadow of the Beatles always loomed large. George found immense success with his solo work, finally stepping out of John and Paul's shadow, but he too carried the scars of the band's painful end. Ringo continued his steady career, a beloved figure, but the brotherhood he cherished was gone. The empire was gone, the money was diminished, but the music, miraculously, endured. The songs, the albums, the legacy, they transcended the bitter end, becoming a timeless testament to their unparalleled genius. The final days at Apple Corps were not just the end of a band, they were the end of an era, a dream shattered, a brotherhood broken, and the world, forever changed by their music, was left to grapple with the profound silence they left behind. The ghost of Apple Corps and the bitter end of the Beatles cast a long shadow over the lives of John, Paul, George, and Ringo for years, where the financial and legal entanglements continued long after the official dissolution. The battle for control over their vast catalogue of songs, their publishing rights, and their accumulated wealth became a complex, ongoing saga that would span decades. For John, the experience of the Apple collapse and the Klein affair left a deep distrust of the music industry and a profound sense of disillusionment. He poured his raw emotions into his early solo work, particularly Plastic Ono Band, an album that stripped away the layers of Beatlemania to reveal the pain and anger beneath. He eventually found a fragile peace in New York, embracing a period of domesticity and raising his son, Sean. He slowly began to reconcile with Paul, George, and Ringo, the shared trauma of their past becoming a strange, unspoken bond. Their phone calls became less acrimonious. Tentative steps towards healing were made. Paul, despite his solo success, often spoke of the pain of the breakup, the loss of his creative partner in John. He continued to champion the Beatles' legacy, even as he forged his own path. George, having found his artistic voice, remained wary of the corporate side of music, preferring a more independent approach. Ringo, ever the peacemaker, maintained friendships with all of them, a quiet witness to their individual struggles and triumphs. The building on Savile Row, once a symbol of their audacious vision, became a stark reminder of what they had lost. It was eventually sold, its psychedelic past fading into memory. The empire they had built, the dream of Apple, had died a slow, painful death, but in its ashes, a new understanding emerged. A realization that true wealth wasn't in money or control, but in the enduring power of their music and the unbreakable bond of their shared history. The final days at Apple Corps were a testament to the fragility of even the greatest successes and the devastating consequences when human relationships are consumed by business and ego. New York City, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered. His life and his journey of reconciliation tragically cut short. His death plunged the world into grief, but it also cast a new light on his life, his struggles, and the enduring legacy of the Beatles. The story of how the Beatles actually died is not a simple narrative of a band breaking up. It's a complex tapestry of creative differences, financial mismanagement, clashing personalities, and the immense pressure of unprecedented fame. The final days at Applecore were the crucible in which their unity was shattered, their friendships tested, and their individual paths irrevocably set. It was a painful, public unraveling that left scars on all of them. But even in their death, as a band, the Beatles' music continued to live. Their songs, their albums, their message of love and peace resonated louder than ever before. The empire they lost was not just a band or a fortune. It was a dream, a brotherhood, a shared vision that had changed the world. And while that dream was shattered, its echoes, its music, its message continued to resonate, amplified by the very struggles that had threatened to silence it. The Beatles, as a unified entity, died in the offices of Applecore, amidst legal documents and bitter arguments. But their spirit, their influence, their revolutionary sound, that lived on and continues to live on, an unfinished chord, resonating through time. They taught us that even the greatest dreams can crumble. But they also taught us that true art, true connection, and true impact can transcend even the most devastating ends. The final days at Applecore were the end of an era, but they were also the beginning of an eternal legacy. The building on Savile Row still stands, a quiet witness to history. The documents of their dissolution are locked away in archives, but the music, the laughter, the arguments, the genius, they echo, a haunting symphony of how the Beatles actually died, and how, in their death, they became immortal. The end. If this story about the complexities of fame, the cost of conflict, and the enduring legacy of the Beatles moved you, do subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that even in the darkest shadows, art and truth can find a way to emerge. What historical moment made you realize the profound impact of a single decision? Tell us in the comments below.